morning, thank you for inviting me. So I would like to build a case for the practicality of reintroducing improvised cadenzas into performance, and I'm going to use Vivaldi's Violin Concertos as a case study for this. So in the 17th and 18th centuries it was really common for performers to improvise during the performance, whether in ornamentation, during the piece, or preluding before a piece, or, as I will talk about here, cadenzas, usually in the last movements, particularly before the final ritornello. And despite this, performers today often choose to perform a cadenza that was written by a different composer, often many years after the date of the original composition. But I would like to argue that it is possible to stylistically improvise a cadenza if you look at historical sources and analyse the manuscripts. I believe you can come up with a method. So to begin, looking at what people have already done, historically informed performance has started looking at improvisation, but this is generally just in ornamentation, and they focus a lot more on other aspects like phrasing and technique for each instrument. But these two performers, David Dolan and Robert Levin, have looked at cadenzas, but for Mozart particularly. So David Dolan is a pianist who's improvised cadenzas to Mozart's concertos, and Robert Levin has published a book of like little segments of motives which you can stitch together to create your own cadenza for Mozart's violin concertos. But this hasn't been done for early 18th century music, and David Dolan is incredible and he performs very well, but that doesn't really help the average performer who would like to have a go. Moving on to academic research, improvisation is quite a young field, and particularly within historically informed research. Colneda there has looked at Vivaldi's concertos and looked at their sort of rhythmic and melodic features, but has actually rather ignored the cadenzas. And McVeigh has looked at the cadenzas, but in terms of where their structural role in the piece. So the idea that they're a chance to re-establish the tonic after a big climax. But nobody has sort of done anything to recreate a stylistic cadenza today. And improvisation, I think it was Bailey who said that it enjoys being the most widely practiced musical activity, but is the least understood or acknowledged, so I hope to contribute to this. Naturally, there are difficulties when you're researching improvisation because we don't obviously have recordings from the time of Vivaldi, but we do have other historical sources which we can use, and these are treatises, reviews, and manuscripts. So, beginning with treatises, cadenzas occur in a lot of treatises from the time, particularly in Quantz, who argues that a cadenza should be spontaneous, unaccompanied, occur before the final ritornello, should surprise the listener, and for singers and wind instrumentalists it should be performed in one breath. It doesn't say anything about that for string instruments. But the key emphasis is on the spontaneity and the novelty of the performance. But you can have all of these instructions. I haven't got time here to go into all of what I found in the treatises, but you can have a very big variation, even with using these instructions. So Cartier's L'Art du Violon, it's a bit later, but it gives you 17 examples of how to improvise on a Tartini adagio. So there's clearly still a lot of room for performance creativity within that. So I then looked at reviews of concerts. So there's an example is Carl Ditters von Dittersdorf, who is said to have improvised a whole violin sonata with accompaniment during a performance. It's pretty amazing, but it shows the value of improvisation at the time, that people were clearly appreciative of it, and that it was a key aspect of performance. Indeed, performers were often judged on how well they could improvise the cadenza, rather that the reviews often talk about a performer based on their improvisational skills rather than how technically well they played the concerto. And Dr. Burney wrote about a concert which was a commemoration for Handel, in which the violinist Duberg spent so long in his cadenza going around different keys that Handel is said to have shouted "You're welcome home" when he eventually returned to the tonic. So this shows that the cadenza was as full of risk and excitement and mistakes as you might expect. Okay, so we can have a sort of an idea of what people might have thought about the cadenzas, but for performance you need to look more deeply. So looking at the manuscripts, a cadenza is often signalled, for example in RV 340 with the phrase, sorry for my pronunciation, "Chi si ferma a piacimento," which means the performer is invited to insert their own improvised cadenza here. And you can see this here, that this is Vivaldi's writing just before the final ritornello. And also you can see here that a lot of the middle parts are missing throughout the concerto, and there are, it's very incomplete. So again, we have to remember that the score was not to be taken as a biblical text, that performers often added stuff, and therefore it's not so surprising that they improvised cadenzas. And there are actually lots of examples of written out cadenzas by Vivaldi, or examples by his accomplished pupil Pisendel, which I have used for my analysis. So having all of this information, I would now like to take you through my analysis of 4 concertos cadenzas that remain written out. So these are either RV 212, 213, 340 and 349. And I picked these because they represent a range of different lengths and difficulties, but also they're all last movement cadenzas, and so they sort of provide a good comparison, but also a good comparative case study. And then I've taken my analysis from these and have suggested guidelines for performers based on this and based on the historical sources. Okay, so this is what I found from my analysis. So the position of the cadenzas, they're always before the final ritornello, and they're often allied into the first note of the ritornello. So you have the final trill, and then da 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 da, and the last note is the first note of the ritornello, which confirms McVeigh's argument that they are there to re-establish the tonic. The key, they very rarely deviate from the tonic, and when they do, these are the examples. I'm not sure how blurry it is, but they deviate in order to keep the sequence the same throughout. It's only very brief and doesn't affect the overall sort of sense of the cadenza. The time signatures are very different, and they can often be different to the rest of the movement, and also within the cadenza they can be very different. So you can have the first bit in 3/4, and then suddenly you switch to 4/4 or the other way around. It shows the freedom that you can have rhythmically in the cadenza. Length ranges from 25 to 81 bars, and the difficulty varies a lot as well. Large, probably because of the different people he was writing for. So a lot of his concertos were written for his female pupils at the Pietà, so they are slightly less accomplished maybe than, for example, Pisendel, his sort of most famous pupil, which many are dedicated to him as well. Then there are others dedicated, for example, to Emperor Charles VI or Prince Ferdinand of Tuscany, so that counts for the differing levels of virtuosity as well. That brings me into range. So the range uses the whole of the violin, often using the bottom G string all the way to very high positions on the E string. Articulation is normally staccato in arpeggio passages and legato in scalic passages, which was common at the time. And so Gerdingen has written a lot of stuff on what he calls schemata. So he sees that most of the 18th century composition was made up of small little segments of musical ideas which stitched together create a piece. So he's analysed so much 18th century music and has found these all the way through. So it's normally like a 4-note figuration in the bass line which matches a figuration in the melody. He argues that these form the basis of 18th century music. So I did look for them in these cadenzas, and they aren't there, which I think is because he put so much emphasis on the harmonic movement, whereas these cadenzas don't deviate from the tonic. So there's no sort of moving bass line to create this the shapes that he suggests. However, I have found other schemata which occur throughout the 4 cadenzas, and this is a very useful device for improvisation. So just as jazz musicians use standards or to improvise on, performers are unlikely to have just played whatever they like in the cadenza looking at the examples. They definitely had a sort of idea of this is, these for example are phrases that I could use and that I probably will use. So I came up with many more. These are just 3 examples. So I don't know how well you can see, but the top one I've called scalic climax because it occurs at the end and involves a downward scale, often from the second highest note of the piece, of the cadenza, sorry. The second one is stepping up, which is this rhythm covering a third, and then the triplet third. This is very common throughout. They were also different rhythmic schemata that I came up with, and together these sort of cover the whole of the cadenza. So this is I've transcribed RV 340, and the highlighted areas show the melodic schemata. The bits that aren't highlighted are covered by the rhythmic schemata. So I don't know if you can see, but this is a scalic climax at the end. You've got the triplet thirds that occur a lot of the time. I didn't have a chance to go into the other ones, but there is a very clear makeup using these schemata. So having looked at a sort of micro level, I took a step back and was like, is there a melodic contour that covers them all? And the answer is roughly yes. So the blue thin line, the wiggly line, shows the pitch movement, and the greener line over the top is sort of a line of best fit, if you will. It's obviously not exact, but there is definitely a curvature going on throughout. So then I wanted to look further at the structure. So all of this analysis I did with the performer in mind, so I didn't want to do any sort of complex graphs or look at any complex ideas because this research is intended to help the performer, and as a performer myself I struggle sometimes with the difficult analysis. So I've just picked out the key moments when the bass note, if you imagine it as a bass note, would change, and what this provides for the cadenza overall. So if you take these notes, you find that they have the sections with the motives have a clear purpose, which you can see in this table. So each cadenza is made up of 3 larger sections. The first one normally just includes bass notes that form the tonic. The second one is much more exploratory, and then you come back to the dominant notes being in the tonic again. And the devices used correspond to the sections. So you have repetition in the first section, sequences in the second section, repetition in the third section. And these have roles of establishing the tonic, then there's a rising and falling scale, and then there's the cadence. And interestingly, the motives correspond to this as well. There's normally 5 motives. So the differing lengths are created by repetition or extended sequencing rather than introducing any new ideas. Sometimes the third motive sort of moulds into the 4th motive, but that is the basic structure. So from this, I created 10 guidelines for the performer to create a stylistic improvisation. So this is that the cadenza should occur before the final ritornello tertientri, which you can see from the historical sources and also the manuscripts that I looked at. The character should match the rest of the movement, should remain in the same key as the rest of the movement, should use a full range of the violin. This is normally 3 octaves. Time signature can be flexible, articulation should vary between staccato and legato. Length can be varied, but as I said before, the structural processes remain. You just use repetition and sequencing to reach the desired length. Performers should follow this large scale 3-part structure, should use the general curvature of the graphs above, and the motives used should draw on the bank of new motivic and rhythmic schemata that I've proposed. Obviously this is a lot of information to have in your head while you're improvising, but because of the motivic and rhythmic schemata, once you have them in your head, they're not as complex as it might seem. It's then not that difficult to apply them, at least in the structure of one motive, two motive, 3, 4, 5, using the tonic and the exploration, and then the cadence at the end. But obviously the first step is to compose example ones, which is what I did. So I have applied my own method and have composed. I composed a couple, but I'll just show you this one here. So I've used the scale at climax example at the bottom that we talked about. There's clearly the first motive, and then you have the second motive, then there's all the sequencing, rising scale, and then the falling scale. Again, this part there's a lot of repetition, and in the top part there's a lot of repetition, and in the middle it's all sequencing. And it does follow the general curve. So I thought I would play for you now. So if I maybe play Vivaldi's first for this, and then I will play my example so you can see. Obviously these are composed, but I hope to be able to get all the schemata and guidelines in my head and be able to improvise soon. That's the plan. But in order to keep the style, we'll just play my first examples for you now. I'll just tune briefly. This is Vivaldi's. This is mine. Thank you. So my conclusions are that it is possible, I think, to create improvised cadenzas in the style of Vivaldi. It's historically accurate and is practically possible with these 10 guidelines. But also this methodology is applicable to other instruments, other time periods, other forms of improvisation, which is exciting for whatever things other people can come up with in the future. So thank you very much.